So for those of you that don't know me, hi, I'm Toby Spiro. I'm the Education Director at AWFS. Really happy to be here as always with Dr. Chris Kuehl, our economist, and giving us regular updates on what's going on. Dr. Kuehl's an Armada chief economist with over 21 years of experience working with private clients and professional associations like us, like AWFS. He's also the chief economist for several national business groups, and he's the economic analyst for the Fabricators and Manufacturers Association, where he writes a biweekly publication, Fabrinomics. He co-edits the Armada flagship brief, which reaches thousands of business executives 3 times a week. And if you're an AWFS member, you know that we also send out to our members their flagship report. He's a sought after keynote speaker. He gives over 100 presentations annually to business and industry associations, both in the US and internationally. And he has spoken with us at the AWFS Fair in addition to these webinars. He holds his doctorate in political economics, advanced degrees in Soviet and Asian studies, and he's previously taught international economics and finance for over 15 years before joining Armada. So, Chris, thank you once again for joining us, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thanks very much. And I will share my exciting slides because nobody is tuning in to see me. So we'll go from there. And one thing I need to point out about my relationship with AWFS, various groups have over the years given me tchotchkes. I mean, I've got mugs that I donate regularly. I've got tumblers. No one else except AWFS has ever given me a wooden bow tie. And so I have to commend you for being the most unique. And I've actually worn it at things other than AWFS. So I just want you to know that I wear my wooden bow tie because I couldn't tie a real bow tie if my life depended on it. So here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about the economy as if I had a clue. One of the things that makes fun to be an economist is that we're kind of like weathermen. You know, no one really expects us to be accurate. Nobody really expects us to know what's going on. We just kind of pretend. And we're one of the few professions where people will keep listening to you no matter how times you're wrong. So here we go. I love this quote from Ben Bernanke. Economics is a very difficult subject. I've compared it to trying to learn how to repair a car when the engine is running. Things change constantly, and they always have. I mean, for the last several months, we have been focused on the rapid changes that began to take place at the first of the year. We've been changing trade policy, we've been changing tariff policy, we have new legislation around taxation and revenue. That isn't that unusual. I mean, we go through these changes all the time. Not long ago, maybe a year ago, Ernst & Young commissioned a study trying to figure out what has been going on for the last 10 years because they said, look, for the last 10 years, we have had a tremendous amount of uncertainty, some of it man-made, some of it related to natural disasters. We had the pandemic, we had the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is still going on. All of those things together, according to this report, cost the major businesses in the United States, Fortune 500 companies, $360 billion in profits. So what we're going through now, we've been going through now for a decade. And when you look forward, there's not a lot that's going to change that pattern. We still have an awful lot of unknowns. And I guess my point is that we've gotten used to them to a degree. You know, we've been dealing with it for a long time. Business in general, the ones that I talked to said, look, we can deal with almost anything if we know the rules. We just need to know what the situation is. If we know what we're dealing with as far as legislation or recession, inflation, with we can adapt, we can figure out what's going on. What kills us is when we don't know. And that's kind of the conversation we've been having most of this year. So one of the things that we were expecting to see was tariff inflation, but it really isn't showing up in the data yet. And I emphasize the yet part, because if you look at the things that have been affecting inflation, basically keeping it down, a lot of it is predictable. A lot of the suppliers, whether they're coming out of China or India or Mexico or anywhere else, they've eaten the tariff. They don't want to lose market share. They have struggled for years to get to where they are within the industry. They don't want to lose their customers because their prices have gone up. So many of them are eating part of that tariff. That's particularly the case when you deal with China, because China can get coverage from its own government. So if you're a Chinese supplier and you're dealing with a high tariff and you've decided to absorb that tariff, you can turn to your government and say, look, I just ate billions of dollars in tariff expense. You need to bail me out. And the government does, because without going into gory detail, those of you who have listened to me before know that I started out as a Soviet specialist back in the 80s. I was going to study the evil empire. I was going to work for the agency. I was going to be a spook. I got a degree in Soviet studies. I learned Russian. I was all set. What's interesting about that background is that I'm still at heart a cold warrior, and I still look at these systems and say, communist-based systems aren't like ours. They are command economies. They are not market economies. A market-based economy, if it was facing this issue of eating that tariff, they couldn't do it very long, because you've got to maintain profitability. You've got to maintain interest by your investors. You've got to do a lot of things. A command economy is motivated by other than market drivers. A command economy, for example, in China, is motivated by the government's need to have people employed. If you have 1,400,000,000 people, you have got to keep them working, because 1,400,000,000 unemployed people will overthrow the government. So if a company in China turns to the government and says, look, if we don't get help, we're going to have to shut down. And if we shut down, all the people working for us are going to be unemployed. And the Chinese government says, oh, no, 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 no. How much do you need? We got to keep you in business. We're keeping you in business not because we need your product necessarily. We're trying to keep people employed. Some of that tariff got absorbed in the supply chain. So you saw a lot of companies finding different places to source, finding different ways to produce. The supply chain itself absorbed a certain amount of that tariff. 10% of it was eaten by the companies buying the stuff. Basically said, look, we had a margin of X. Well, now our margin is lower. We have decided that, again, we need to protect market share. We're just going to figure out how to deal with this, and we'll lower our margin. Much of this and the rest, of course, is passed on to the consumer. You can't do a lot of this stuff forever. You can't control the supply chain forever. You can't give up margin forever, and you can't pass on the cost to the consumer forever. Sooner or later, there's going to be a rebellion. So it's not sustainable long term. That's what's got a lot of people looking at the last couple quarters of this year, saying, okay, we've covered ourselves for the first 2 quarters. Third quarter, fourth quarter may be a whole different story, because a lot of this stuff is not sustainable. If you look at the current consumer price index, where you have seen energy making a difference, where you've seen food making a difference, these have not necessarily been related to tariffs. The beef industry, not necessarily connected to tariffs. And coffee, sugar, a little bit. Natural gas, electricity, gas, oil, no. Those have not actually been affected much by the tariff policy. This has been a lot more domestic. It's international behavior when it comes to the energy sector. So if you look at things that are related to construction, which obviously matters a lot to AWFS members, you're seeing a kind of a difference depending on what it is that's involved in the project. And you've got to look at a lot of these things in a little bit of a complex way. So steel is about 25% of the weight in a given project, aluminum 15%, lumber right up around 20%. The tariff rate for these have gone considerably higher, but you've got other factors playing into this. So the adjusted increase is a little bit less than the stated tariff rate. So you've definitely seen an impact in construction prices, but the biggest problem is that nobody quite knows what's next. We work with a lot of construction companies and they're like, yeah, if pricing is an issue, our biggest problem is we don't know what to quote a client. We don't know what the tariffs are going to be coming up. We don't know what the impact is going to be on our supply. So we don't know what to quote. And we're kind of waiting around for security. We're waiting around for things to calm down. When they finally calm themselves, then we can adjust. If it's a high tariff, we'll adjust. If it's a low tariff, we'll adjust. But we need to know what we're looking at. And that's been the biggest problem this year is that tariff policy is being used for a lot of things. It's partly driven by economic issues. It's partly driven by trying to beef up the U.S. productive capacity, but it's also politics. It's also personal. You look at things like the tariffs we've imposed on India. India was the golden child 4 or 5 months ago. Everyone was looking at India like, oh, here's how we're going to counter China. If we don't want to be as dependent on China as we have been, oh, we'll just do business with India. That's great. India's a democracy. Trump gets along with Narendra Modi. We'll be fine. But Trump is more interested in putting pressure on Russia than he is on putting pressure on China right now. So he has turned to the Indians and said, look, you are supporting the Russian war effort by buying their oil. You are the biggest consumer of Russian oil. You're also buying military equipment from Russia. We don't want you to do that. If you stop buying oil from Russia, if you stop buying military equipment from Russia, we'll reduce that tariff or maybe even eliminate it. And the Indians are like, well, here's the problem. If we don't buy Russian oil, we end up having to turn to the Middle East. And the Middle East is an Islamic part of the world. In case you hadn't noticed, we are a Hindu nation. And we have had an ongoing conflict with the Muslim population of our own country, as well as those around us for decades. So what you're telling us is you want us to be dependent on Islamic countries for our oil. That's probably not a good idea if you're a Hindu nation. When it comes to military hardware, remember that for decades you, US, would not sell us military equipment because you were allied with Pakistan. And Pakistan did not want the US to sell military equipment to India, so we didn't. And the Indians bought instead from Russia. So they're like, well, look, our whole military is based on Russian equipment. So if we don't buy from them, the last time we checked, the United States is not making Russian military equipment. So we're not in a position to completely replace our Air Force and our Army with US weaponry because for 40, 50 years, you wouldn't sell it to us anyway. So that kind of complicates the whole tariff complication because it's not economic, it's not driven by some of the bigger issues. It's very, very targeted right now that Trump really wants to play a role in ending the Russian-Ukraine war. And to do that, he has to put pressure on Russia. The problem is we don't do much with Russia. We never have bought much from them. We don't sell much from them. We have no leverage. So we have to go to other countries that do have leverage and ask them to get engaged. So another big issue that's circulating around is the Fed and what's the Fed going to do when it comes to interest rates. For the last year, it's been pretty much a constant story. We are not going to lower interest rates. The inflation threat is too high. Every time they have a meeting, they hold steady. At the last meeting, they began to suggest that maybe the time has come to lower rates, but it wasn't unanimous by any stretch. And again, I don't want to go into gory details about how the Fed works, but there's been such an emphasis on Chairman Powell, like he has some kind of extraordinary power at the Fed. He doesn't. He's the chairman, but that is almost a figurehead job. He was originally brought into the Federal Reserve as the regulatory guy. He was brought in because a good half to a third of what the Fed does is regulate banks. So the regulatory side of what they do doesn't get a lot of headlines, but it's what banks have to respond to. His background was regulatory. His background was kind of as an organizer. He is not the dominant economist. He is not an economist. He is not even a banker. He's a regulatory guy. So when you look at the Fed minutes, and I'm sure you all read those faithfully. I mean, it's the gripping reading. You can hardly wait. They come out and you're like, oh, you run to your computer and download it. I know you do. Well, if you did, you would discover that the most dominant voice is not Chairman Powell, it's Doug Waller. Actually, Chris Waller, Doug Waller, he goes by both. He is the dominant economist. He is the one that used to be the head of research at the St. Louis Fed. And as a member of the Board of Governors, he's very influential. He is really the economic voice. When he talks, that represents sort of what the Fed is thinking at a given moment. And at their last meeting, he said, I think the time has come for interest rate cuts. And all of a sudden, that's the conversation that maybe they come down by a quarter point this month, maybe they come down by another quarter point in December, but you're now getting conversation. But also remember that the Fed is a funny organization when it comes to decisions about rates. The decision is made by the Board of Governors, and remember that about a third of them don't even get engaged in this conversation. They're the regulatory people, they don't even participate in the conversation about interest rates. But every year you have 4 different regional Fed presidents that sit on the open market committee, which is the group that makes that call. They rotate. They have a 1-year term, then it goes to another 4, then it goes to another 4, because there are 12 regional banks. These people have an immense amount of power because they're the eyes and ears of the Fed. Furthermore, they are not appointed by the president or Congress. So the regional Fed presidents are appointed by a local board. So there, for example, is a Fed in Kansas City, where I'm from. So Kansas City has a Fed president, and the Kansas City board is the group that picks that Fed president. This has always been the most conservative, hawkish Fed in the system. Back in 2008, when the Fed cut its rates to 0, and it was a big dramatic moment, it was nearly unanimous. The one exception was Tom Honig from the Kansas City Fed. And he said, cutting rates to 0 is a stupid thing to do. It's going to come back to bite you. And when it did, he was front page on the Wall Street Journal saying, I told you, and I told you what year it was going to happen. Honig retired, was replaced by Esther George. Esther George, charming middle-aged woman until the subject of inflation comes up, and then she looks like something out of The Exorcist. I mean, her head begins to spin. Inflation is evil. She hated inflation. She retired and was replaced by Jeff Schmid. Jeff Schmid is a replacement and a disciple of Paul Volcker. You all remember Paul Volcker back in the 1980s when we were being hit with rampant inflation, out of control. Volcker was brought in. Can you control inflation, Uncle Paul? Why, yes, he said, I can. I'm going to raise interest rates by 10 points in one meeting. This will cause virtually every business in the United States to fail. They will end up firing all of their people. People who are fired don't have any money. If you don't have any money, you can't spend any. And if you can't spend any, nobody can raise their prices. You're welcome. But Uncle Paul, that's going to give us recession. Yep, 2 to 5 years, maybe 10, 20, 50, 100, I don't know. You didn't bring me in for a recession. You brought me in to control inflation. I did. So Schmid is a disciple of Paul Volcker. When you ask him what he thinks interest rates should be right now, he says 10 points. We're too much in debt. This is ridiculous. We need to worry about inflation. Why are you trying to lower rates now? He's on the board of governors or the open market committee right now. He will not be next year. So he rotates off. But of the 4 that will be coming in next year, 3 of them are hawks coming from hawkish banks. You've got a representative from Dallas, you have one from Philadelphia, you have one from Richmond, you got one from Minneapolis. I mean, it's not a pro interest rate lowering group. So looking ahead, the Fed will probably drop rates a couple times this year, but not by a lot, quarter point a time, which isn't a huge cut. If things get even dicier, and right now they're watching the job reports really closely, if they get really worried, there might be a half point cut in there somewhere, but it may not be until late next year before they do it again. So Q3 so far has been a little ahead of expectations. We thought it would be probably around 2%. It's cruising at about 2.5, 2.6. That decline we saw in the first quarter was entirely due to all the imports that were coming in. Imports pull away from your GDP. So we bounced back in second quarter, nearly 3% growth. We're now looking at something close to that going ahead into third quarter. Fourth quarter is kind of a toss-up. Nobody quite knows what the consumer is thinking, and that's 55% of GDP. So a lot of attention paid to the Christmas season. So we've also seen a little bit of indicator coming out of a non-residential fixed investment. The structures really gives you an insight into what is happening as far as investment is concerned, and it's been showing a little bit of a sign of decline. So my screen just popped up and said my internet is unstable, probably making a remark about me. Sorry, the technology is Toby and I were just talking about that a minute ago, because his system was acting up too, and it's like I'm always amazed at people who become enamored with tech, and it's like, really? Have you ever actually used it? It's like, oh well, enough. I'm a dinosaur, and I'll admit it. Manufacturing construction spending has been growing like crazy. It's been expanding since 2022 and way above where it had been literally for the past decade. It used to be about $60 billion a year average. Look what it's been the last 2 years, 225 billion. So slowing down a lot, you're beginning to see the percent change, the orange line, coming back down to kind of reality. But the actual spend, the black line, is still high. And this is basically indicating that building for the manufacturing sector is still very much on fire. And which
Apologies,
has been,
everybody. Sorry,
yep,
Chris. I think you cut out again for a minute. You were
yeah,
saying building is still on fire. I would
yeah.
also try maybe turn the camera off. That might help your Wi-Fi.
Well, we'll try. I don't think anything helps Wi-Fi. I think it's basically, I hate technology, to be honest. It's like whenever I get a chance, I try to actually try to figure out how to do this without turning off the whole thing. Go away. It's not even letting me do that. It's like the
There you go.
joys of.
I That's okay. I turned it off for you.
All right, very good. So I apologize. The next time somebody talks to you about, oh, AI is going to change the entire world, you have my permission to punch them right in the mouth, because it's not going to until we get decent technology. Okay, so going on to one of the slides, it comes from Armada. This is the flagship that Toby mentioned in the beginning. We do a thing every month called the Watch, and it looks at a whole series of factors that play into the economy. We look at construction, we look at manufacturing, we look at a lot of different things. What makes this stand out is that we have been remarkably accurate with our predictions. The prediction is the orange line in the middle, and then the range are the lines to the north and south. So you get a dotted line to the north, you get a dotted line to the south, and these are what happen if some of the variables change. We have a model that's built on, I think there's 26 variables now. The guy that built this with us for us is a retired colonel who used to be in the artillery. And he pointed out that in his old job, accuracy was really, really, really important. And he developed a very complicated system to track his shells, which he now uses to track the economy. So you look at non-residential, that's going to include pretty much everything from warehousing to energy development to office buildings. I mean, anything that's not residential. It's been holding fairly steady after a really sharp increase that began to take place kind of post-pandemic. So it has held on to that growth. Can still see a lot of growth, particularly driven by things like data centers. So as our demand for technology increases, well, we now know, obviously, that we need a lot more support. I mean, anybody who's tried to do things in tech right now, their biggest frustration is half the time it doesn't have enough oomph to work. And it's like we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough connectivity, et cetera. And that's driving a lot of this construction. Construction materials have continued to go up. They're up like 3.1% below the May rate, and their index has begun to show a little bit of decline from its peak, but it's coming back up again. So the construction materials, for obvious reasons, we've got tariffs involved. We have demand on the construction materials, which has driven up prices. We have shortages that are not even related to tariffs. So these things continue to push the producer price index up. If you look at retail, it's in many ways the highlight of the US economy right now. That is ridiculously high growth. So if you look at the graph on the left, even the not very favorable version, the one that has the kind of the variables falling a little bit, it's still growing higher than it was even a year ago. So even the bad news line is growing. The good news line, the line to the north, that's absurd. I mean, that's practically exponential. And our prediction right in the middle, still growing all the way through 26 and holding its own. Retail spending has been driven predominantly by one group, and we're keeping a very close eye on that one group. That one group is the upper income consumer. The upper income consumer, that group that's making over 100,000 a year, they're spending like there's no tomorrow. They are still driving the economy. People that are in the bottom third, they have essentially checked out. They're not able to do much of anything. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're barely able to keep up with inflation and are slowly falling behind, in some cases, quickly falling behind. The middle third is still spending as long as their jobs are secure. So if they're of the opinion that their job is secure, then they're continuing to spend. But that upper income group is spending like crazy because they made the majority of their money off the markets. The markets have been booming for so long that they have contributed something like $37 trillion to the economy. I mean, that's a staggering amount of money. And all by themselves, they can drive the economy. One of our clients is a company that counsels car dealers. And so I've talked a lot to car dealer groups. And one of the things I was asking, has inflation affected your business? I mean, the average price of a car now is 46 grand. Is it affecting consumer behavior? And this one dealer said, well, yes and no. I can't sell inexpensive cars for nothing. I mean, the people who would be in the market for that car are in the bottom third. They have no money. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're not buying. The people in the upper third, they're the ones buying the high-end cars, and I can't keep those things on my lot more than about a day. And he was talking about a guy that came into his dealership and was looking at an $80,000, $90,000 Beamer, and then he didn't see him for several months. And when he came back, that same car was now 120,000, 130,000. And he said, "So, are you still interested?" "Yeah." "You know, it's $125,000 now." "Yeah, I can read." "You're still interested?" "Dude, I'm rich. Okay, I made money off the markets. Do you think I'm so stupid that I don't understand that I can get a much cheaper car if all I want is transportation?" This isn't about transportation. This is about status. This is about me showing off. I have a 4-car garage in my house. This car is never going to be in it. It is going to be in the parking lot so my neighbor can look out his window into my driveway and see my car and realize what a loser he is because I have a nicer car than he does. So he's not the least bit concerned about inflation. He even told this dealer, he said the fact that it's more expensive is a good thing because now it's a $125,000 piece of show off when it was only an $80,000 piece of show off before. Really different patterns when people are at different income levels. And so that kind of shows up in the data. Manufacturing in general, if you look at this slide, still growing. And it's still growing because of automotive. It's still growing because of what's being developed around energy. Certain amount of growth attributed to aerospace, but still growing. Even the not so happy version to the south is holding its own. And if you get encouraging news, that just takes off. So one of the things that is kind of a risk to the economy that we're keeping an eye on and certainly has implications for AWFS members is the housing market. It's 16% of GDP. So it's one of the largest parts of our entire GDP. It has often been said that as the housing market goes, so goes the entire economy. What's worrying analysts is that the monthly supply of homes is currently trending at 9.8 months of inventory. It has rarely been that high. It's the highest level since 1981. When there's that much housing stock on the market, it depresses prices. And you've begun to see a little bit of that decline depending on where you are in the country. The trick with housing is that it's so regional. And, whenever you talk about the monthly supply of homes and what it might be doing to prices, you're going to get somebody from Nashville or Dallas who are like, "What are you saying? This is ridiculous. No, housing prices haven't fallen here, but other parts of the country they have. Depends on where people have chosen to live." Single family home starts are down sharply. They're down 0.5% total, but look at what happened to single family. It's been down 10%. Multifamily is way up. So people who can't afford to buy a house are going to have to rent. But the bigger issue, and part of the reason we've got so many homes on the market, is what the boomers are doing. So this is a subject that affects a lot of the economy. By the end of this decade, every single boomer will have reached retirement age. That's 76 million people. And if you've listened to economists talk about kind of the mother of all recessions in 2030, it's going to be a disaster, blah, blah, blah. Frankly, nobody in the economics world can predict that far ahead. So when you talk to them and say, well, what are you talking about? That's like 4 or 5 years from now. Okay, we're not really predicting. We're simply pointing out that by 2030, you have a demographic collapse. You have the entire boomer generation at retirement age. Now, they won't all retire at once. They're boomers. They're notorious for not having lives, so they just keep working and they'll continue to until they can't anymore. But at some point, they do leave. At some point, they look around and say, I want to enjoy my golden weeks, so I think I'm actually going to retire now. We don't have replacements for them. More importantly, in the housing sector, they're moving out of their single family homes. They're like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I don't want to mow lawns. I don't want to shovel snow. I don't do any of that. I'm going to move into senior living. I want to move into any sort of communal type atmosphere where I don't have to do all that stuff. So the boomers are getting rid of their homes and moving into multifamily. Gen Z isn't interested in single family at all. They're like, nope, we're perfectly happy in an apartment or a studio or whatever. We don't really want kids right now, if ever. So we're having an entire single family sector driven by Gen X, which is the smallest cohort, and some millennials. The millennials are actually having kids. Permits are down. So the residential market is not at the crisis level that it was in 2007, but it's sharply weaker than it was over the past 18 years. And that has a big impact on any industry that's connected to construction and housing in particular. So again, residential construction, the risk forecast doesn't look too bad at this point. We're still seeing a little bit of growth. It's been under the long-term trend until very recently, and it's kind of coming back going into next year. But it's important to understand that most of what's driving that is still multifamily, not the single family. The other thing that's driving residential are people moving to different parts of the country, trying not to pay too much. So people who were in high tax, high cost of living states are leaving those states in order to find a low cost, low tax alternative. And you get studies that kind of accelerate this conversation. A study was done asking the simple question, what would you have to make to live a comfortable life in any state in the United States? So if you wanted to live a comfortable life, and granted that's kind of a loose definition, as a single person in California, you would need to make $200,000 a year. If you want to live that same comfortable life as a single person in North Dakota, it's 50,000 a year. And that's one of the reasons that Fargo is now one of the faster growing cities in the United States, which just floors people. They're like, what, you don't get the Weather Channel? You don't understand that, Fargo is going to be 9,000 feet of snow and 80 degrees below zero? Well, yeah, but I have a friend who just retired to Fargo, and we're like, "What are you thinking?" So residential construction has basically followed pricing, that people are looking for bargains and they're finding it in kind of unusual states. Some of the fastest growing states in the country are in the Midwest or the Southeast, and you're seeing a lot of exodus out of the far west, and you're seeing it out of the northeast because the prices are higher. So as we look ahead, we'll probably see that continue to accelerate because people are looking for alternatives. And it's easier to move now. I mean, once upon a time, that was a big, huge deal. It isn't even something that your job prohibits, because if you can do what you're doing remotely, well, you can pretty much move anywhere you want. So, see if we can get this to move. Here we go. Global manufacturing, I throw this in here, and not that it's a big, huge thing for AWFS members. This is the Purchasing Managers Index. So am I still connected here? Can't tell. All right, I'm just going to keep going. My little picture disappeared. So it's the thing about the PMI that's nice is that it's a reliable index. It's different than a lot of other indices because the purchasing manager, as a rule, doesn't know enough to lie and manipulate. So when they're asked a simple question, which is, are you buying more? Are you buying less? They give an honest answer. And the diffusion index is a simple one. Anything over 50 is considered growth. Anything under 50 is considered contraction. So the US, as recently as last month, was in growth, barely 52.9. We're now in contraction slightly. 49.8 is not that far off from 50. And if you look down the list, most countries are in that high 40 category. So they're not far away from growth, but they're sliding just a little bit. The numbers are down from what they were a month before. If you look at the service side, there's been a lot more stability. The numbers are pretty reliable. We're beginning to see a little bit of concern with the leading economic indicators. This is the stuff that comes from the conference board. And the thing that's been dragging it down, consumer expectations, not performance. The consumers are still spending. Retail is still strong. They're expecting things to get worse. So when you're talking to a consumer about a long-term project, so are you thinking of buying a car? Are you thinking of buying a house? Are you thinking of getting a big renovation at your house? That's when expectations play a role, because then the consumer says, well, I was thinking about it, but I think things are going to get worse at the end of the year, beginning of next, so maybe I won't. Manufacturing new orders, same thing. You're seeing decent performance currently, but new orders are the things that suggest that you're going to see more growth later. And right now, the manufacturer's like, well, we're not sure. So until we see some evidence that there's going to be more demand, we're kind of pulling back. Unemployment claims have begun to go up a little bit. Not bad. I mean, we're still like 4.2% unemployment, but they're higher than they used to be. So if you look at one other factor that plays a role as far as housing and almost any type of lending activity, it's delinquency. So there's good and bad news in this chart. The good news is, and many of you lived through this, remember when we had the big mortgage collapse a few years back in 2011, 2012, 2010. I mean, it was miserable. You had foreclosures by the millions. We're not seeing that. Mortgage problems are way at the bottom of the list of delinquencies. We're seeing very, very, very little in the way of foreclosure activity anywhere in the country. So even places that have been stressed by high prices, still relatively low. Revolving loans, which are frequently based on home equity, again, nearly at the bottom. Very little damage as compared to what it was in 2010, 2009, where we're seeing a little bit of concern, but even now, not hugely, is auto loans. Auto loans are kind of back to that crisis level they hit in 2010, but it hasn't exceeded that. So you're seeing a little bit of distress with auto loans. The real problem, the blue line, credit cards. Credit card debt is back to levels that were record setting 10 years ago. And it's predictable. People who were in that lower third are having to use their credit cards to pay for day-to-day expenses, and that's driven up their debt. And then you have the student loan issue. Gosh, we haven't heard about that at all, have we? For a long time, we were kind of lying to ourselves about delinquency because we didn't have the data. And the data was finally released earlier this year. And lo and behold, student loan debt is a serious issue. It came bouncing back to record levels very fast. The challenge with the student loan is there's three different groups, and we worry about them at different levels. The group at the top that we worry the least about, those are the people that went to a reputable school and got a reputable degree. So they got degrees in accounting and law and went into med school or whatever it was. So they racked up a lot of debt, but they're in a business where they can pay back their loan. They're not going to like it, and it's going to slow down a lot of their plans as far as homes and all the rest, but they can make good on their loan. The next group is causing a little bit more concern. They went to a reputable school, but majored in something stupid, to put it gently. They got degrees in things that don't translate very well into the business world. And it's like, well, you may have enjoyed studying 18th century history, but there's not a lot of companies that need an 18th century history major. And so they're taking jobs that probably have nothing to do with their education and don't pay all that well. they will probably be able to handle the payback, but it will be more of a stress. The group we really worry about are the ones in the bottom third that went to a not reputable school and got what amounts to a worthless degree from a degree mill. At one point, California graduated 90,000 people in 1 year with degrees in cosmetology. California doesn't need 90,000 new cosmetologists every year, but these were degree mills that simply milked the money from the students via the government. And now these people have debt, and there's absolutely no way they're going to be able to pay it back. The data is having an impact on people's attitude towards loans. 46.7 think credit will be harder to get than last year, highest since 24. 8.5 weren't even applying because they didn't think they'd get approved. 33% probability of rejection for big ticket loans, and getting that 2000 plus money for a down payment, lowest percentage in history. So you have a lot of people who might have been in the housing market, but not under these circumstances. So the number of consumers with new foreclosures and bankruptcy, very low. And bankruptcy numbers, very low compared to where they've been in the past. That's the good news. But it's one of those things that we're going to watch like a hawk, because when they shift, excuse me, they can shift fast. Long-term labor market problem, and I really am coming to the end of all this. I kind of alluded to this before. You got that 76 million people coming out of the job market theoretically. Now, realistically, they're not all going to jump out all at once, but you've got the potential for about a 21, 22 million boomer retirement between now and 2030. During that same period of time, you get about 2.3 million new entrants. That is a tremendous gap. And it's going to be a very difficult one to fill. So a lot of conversation about, well, maybe technology will do it, maybe AI will do it. Depends on the business you're in. I've yet to see an AI program that does woodworking. I mean, it certainly has a contribution to the machines. It can do all kinds of things faster than we've seen it in the past. But AI is the latest kind of over enthusiastic big thing, in my opinion. And as I begin to look at how people are using it, extremely effective in terms of looking at your own data and understanding what's happening in your own company. When you start looking at AI as it looks at the economy as a whole, it gets a little tricky. It's not as accurate as one would think. So with that, I'm going to leave some time for questions. Not much. I think we're right at the witching hour here, getting close. Um, any questions at all? I think you could put them in the chat room, I think, or I don't know
There,
if Toby can
yeah,
let
Chris,
you
there's
in.
there's the Q&A, everyone down at the bottom if you have any questions you want to
Very
ask.
good.
And there is one from earlier, Chris, back when you were talking about manufacturing and top third, middle third, bottom third
Hmm.
of spenders, you said $100,000 a year. Was that per person or household?
Yeah, that's well. Probably from the economic perspective, it would be looking at it as per household, but it almost comes out as per person. It's basically if you have a dominant earner in the household, they'll be looking at what they make. If you've got two people in a household that are making six-figure incomes, well, you're further up than the upper third. But it's a kind of a rough number because you certainly have people, particularly since that group is the group that made the majority of their money off the markets. And so whenever you're looking at their income, there's kind of a difference between what is readily accessible and what is kind of theoretical. It's like, I mean, I had breakfast today with a friend who's been retired. Technically he's got $3.1 million. Does he have immediate access to it? No. It's in a whole bunch of investment accounts and that kind of stuff. But suffice it to say, they're wealthy, and most of us are not.
All right, that was that question. Does anybody else have any other questions you'd like to type into the Q&A?
I'm looking at the chat right now. Okay, don't see anything right away. One thing I was going to throw out that was kind of related to the changing demographics and just sort of how we adapt to it. As companies struggle to find replacements for their key workers, there's going to be a lot more attention paid to things like education and training. And not to bash on the education system as a whole, but when I've been to AWFS meetings, it's always amazing to me how little attention many states give to the trade schools that generate the people that work in your industry. And I remember being at a show a couple, 3 years ago where there was a student competition and, seeing what the students could make, et cetera. Incredibly impressive stuff. I mean, just absolutely craftsman level stuff. And every one of these students I talked to said it was been a real struggle to stay in the school, that there's just not enough support and money. And I'm like, we give away billions of dollars for people to get degrees that have no relevance in the modern economy. And it's like, but yet the students that are going to trade schools, learning a craft, learning trades, are frequently on their own. And it's like, you better come up with the money. From where? Particularly when some of the kids that I was talking to are from rural areas, and it's like, yeah, there needs to be some attention paid to that. And everybody I talked to in the industry was saying, yeah, recruiting has got to be one of our biggest challenges.
Well, Chris, one, thank you for that. I very much agree, and I heard that from a lot of students this past show too. We do have one more question that just popped up. How do you see the current ruling facing the Trump administration questioning the legality of the tariffs that were
Hmm.
implemented, potentially affecting interest rates and ultimately the economy?
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation because this began 2 or 3 months ago, and the court that originally ruled on this, their function is to rule on trade issues. And they came back and said, look, we are not commenting on tariffs in general. All we are saying is that the tool that was used to impose the global tariffs is inappropriate. This was the Emergency Powers Act of, I think, 1973. That act was designed to protect the U.S. monetary system. It was there to protect against assaults on the bonds and the dollars. So it wasn't set up to deal with tariffs and trade. So the court came back and said, look, you do whatever you want with tariffs. There's lots and lots of other ways to put tariffs, and you can't use this. And the reason that it was chosen by the Trump administration was that it was quick. You could use it right away. It was designed, like it said, for emergencies. So you didn't have to go through a lot of rigmarole to put it in place. So the court came back and said, look, if you want to put these tariffs in place, you have these laws that have been in place since the 1930s. You have all kinds of techniques, but they all had a little bit of an inhibition. There was one that went back to 1932, but you could only put the tariff in place for 90 days. You had another one that was, again, easily implemented, but you could only raise tariffs by 15%. So the lower court found that this was not legal, got bumped to the basically the next round of courts, and they supported the lower court and said, no, this is not appropriate. Use some other tool. What's going to happen now is that it's going to be appealed again, and it's going to be eventually, I'm sure, appealed to the Supreme Court. The court that just made the ruling said you can leave these tariffs in place until mid-October. And then, one way or the other, either going to have to get an extension of the extension or you're going to have to drop them. If indeed those are ruled illegal, all of the tariffs that were put in place under that rule go back to what they were at the beginning of the year. And then they have to start all over and come up with more rules. What undoubtedly would happen is if this was upheld and you can't use that tool, the Trump administration will come back and say, okay, fine, we'll use the law from 1932 or the law from 1944. and deal with the limitations. And the limitations are generally time. And so it would probably not change the tariff policies substantially in the short term. By the end of the year, they could have some fairly interesting modifications. And my guess is that they would use other tools. To be honest, tariffs are about the least effective way of protecting a country. What we have traditionally done is the non-tariff barrier. 73% of our protection is non-tariff barriers. Those are regulatory, and they're really hard to get in place, but once they are, they're permanent. The challenge with the tariffs, even if they're upheld, they're only as good as the presidential signature. If he changes his mind, if the next president changes their mind, they vanish. And so a lot of companies I talk to saying, would you just use an NTB? Because that I can count on and that I can adjust to. So stay tuned. Lots of politics, lots of court cases.
Chris, do you have time for just one more last
Yep, I
question?
definitely do. Sure.
So we have one more that says, what effects, if any, do you see with data gathering from Trump's firing of the Department of Labor and Statistics head person?
Yeah, that's going to be a bit of a problem to adjust to because there is probably no statistic harder to gather than employment. And for kind of obvious reasons. We are not required to report to anyone whether we have a job or not. So it takes time to figure out if people are employed. It'll show up in tax records, it'll show up in payroll numbers. And there's always a lot of adjustment going on because we're trying to figure out who hired who when. Some people we can track easily because they're getting unemployment and they're formally in the system. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics has always had a category that is the frustrated worker. And this is the person who's out of work, but they're not in the system. So they're just as unemployed, but they're not getting any help. Lately, we've had to deal with the gig economy. One of the ways we track employment is the household survey. And we simply ask somebody, is there anybody working in the household? People who are doing DoorDash and Uber and Lyft will frequently answer, no, I am not working. What do you mean you're not working? You're in that stupid car every day. It's not a real job. I don't have a boss. I don't have to drive. If I don't feel like driving tomorrow, I don't. I don't have to drive until next August. I don't care. We don't track them. We're not even counting them as employed or we don't know what to count them as. And there have always been categories that drive economists nuts. I mean, this sounds stupid, but one of the hardest sectors, drug dealing. We know there's a lot of business going on. There's a lot of money involved. Drug dealers won't fill out forms. I don't know what the deal is, but they just won't. And so we don't really know, how many people are making a living that way. So what is very likely to happen if people start to distrust BLS data and they're going to question it, there are all sorts of other ways of tracking employment. One of the most reliable, interestingly enough, is from a private company, ADP, the payroll people. They literally have information the BLS doesn't because the data that comes into the BLS may take weeks or months. ADP knows instantly. Did you hire that person? Yeah. Are you paying them? Yeah. Are they on the payroll? Yeah. They're employed. So you're going to see an awful lot of people looking at the ADP numbers going, oh, that's the real deal. That's who's really working and not working. So it's really hard to establish. And my last comment on this, and I know I'm beating this to death, as I mentioned earlier, I used to be a Soviet guy. Back when I was studying the Soviet Union, every single piece of data was a lie. Every single piece. So you had to constantly look at something from 14 different angles to figure out what the real deal was because they lied about everything. So you had to just, I did projects that literally took months to do, trying to figure out how much corn they produced. I had to figure out what kind of corn they planted and then look up the weather reports for every place in the country where they planted corn to figure out how much they could conceivably have grown. and it was nowhere near what they said they were going to do. It was 1/10 of what they said their harvest was going to be. So statistics is fun. It's the most sophisticated form of lying that exists.
All right. And with that very cheery note,
There you go.
thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it.
You're
Appreciate your
welcome.
time. And thank you everybody for attending. Really appreciate it.